Well, hello and welcome to part one of a little short series on arc fault breakers. Now in this little study we're going to look at Siemens only because that's the brand that I have in my little house when we do this little project as it goes. So we're going to look at the arc faults and to some degree the ground faults and dual function breaker requirements that the NEC now requires because we're doing an upgrade. I'm going to talk about it here in part one as I flash some numbers up that come up and over, and at the end we'll show you a little comparison table. And again, these are just 15s and 20s single poles only. We're not going in beyond that. So with no further ado, let's get the show started. Well, here are the breakers that I have laid out essentially in my panel plan for putting that kitchen in upstairs, and we'll get to a number of circuits. We'll talk about the NEC. We'll go in there and look at the NEC 2020. The latest edition that's out there may not be what you have adopted, may not be what's adopted in my area, but in the state of Tennessee, the Fire Marshal's Office, who's ultimately responsible for the building safety regulations, whether they then allow other jurisdictions to do their own inspections is a different issue. The state sets the minimum, and right now what they have been taking has always been, if you find something in the latest code that's the newest and improved, the best that there is, and so if the newest code clarifies it or makes it better, that we can do it that way. So I actually have building permits out on this. All of my legal regulations that I know of will be followed and we will be inspected. But speaking with my local inspector before I got started, I asked him about the very expensive arc fault type of breakers, what I would be required to replace. Back in the day, Tennessee said, okay, when this house was built, we're going to do arc faults, but they are a pain in the backside. And so they allowed an exclusion. They said, we will have arc faults in bedrooms on their power receptacles in the bedrooms and nowhere else. That's the way it was for years and years and years. And through the newer and better version, they've slowly expanded it, and we'll talk about some logic fallacies that they are using both in the code and at the government, at the state of Tennessee. We'll look at those in just a minute. But let's go ahead and talk about what the breakers cost. Okay, now if you can find certain ones, they are unique to the panels that they are to be installed in. Else, the first thing your home inspector, your electrical inspector is going to do, he's going to run to your panel, flip that door open, see what brand it is, and look for any unbranded breakers in there or non-matching brands. So if I had a Square D is great, unless I put a Square D breaker in a Siemens panel or a GE panel, in which case they will fail it, say that they're totally inadequate and you can't do it because they weren't made for it. So the first thing that a homeowner gets caught with usually is having a bad branded breaker or a breaker that doesn't match the panel board. They like to catch that. It's easy, it's quick, and they get instant failure, and they get to call you, you get to call them back with a new permit later on. So here what we have are what we call dual functions, okay? These are for the existing requirements for GFI around a water source, particularly since I'm putting in a little bit of a kitchen to do sausages and whatnot, maybe bake a little bit of bread. I need a countertop receptacles, at least 2 circuits. We'll show you where they come from, and they have to be ground fault protected. But they also, because they are receptacles, will also have to be arc fault protected as we have adopted here locally. Now, talking with my inspector, he suggested I just save the money and go with the arc fault, ground fault combination or dual function. I don't know exactly how people will phrase it. These Siemens use the terminology dual function. So this takes the place both of an arc fault type of breaker and the GFI type of breaker and or receptacle that you see at that first outlet in like a bathroom or outside or in your kitchen and whatnot. So this takes care of both of them. These 2 breakers, I did mail order. I couldn't find them locally. So I mail ordered them to fit my panel, and they were $110 for those 2 breakers. But look on the bright side. We saved the 20 bucks it takes to put a ground, a GFIC receptacle in. Now that's what they normally run, about $15, $20, $22 retail locally. I have seen some at Harbor Freight for much cheaper, and eBay even less than that. However, do not use used equipment in your home. It won't pass inspection. It's against IRC, and also I believe you'll find NEC doesn't like it either, or the NFPA 70, depending on how you want to do it. So what are these? These look like a whole bunch of circuits added into this panel. And what we had upstairs, I'll show you a picture of it, is what we call a 20-30 panel, where it's got 20 spaces but can take up to 30 circuits. And what we have is these, what we call tandems, because tandems are 2 together, which is different than a half-size breaker. Some old panels may have actually been made to have a half-size breaker, which they'd snap in by themselves. These have to go in tandem or 2-in-1, and they're actually one molded breaker part right here, this thing right here. So it's a tandem breaker, and these breakers can only go in the bottom 5 slots. Here's 2 slots on this one, 2 slots with this one, and 1 remaining slot here. So this is in my 2010 panel, 2030 panel. We can have 20 slots, and the lower 5 on each side, that makes 10, can be double breakers for 20 there. So I can have 10 up top and then a maximum of 20 on the bottom. You cannot put, in most cases, check with your manufacturer, you most likely cannot put a tandem or and I wouldn't use the word double breaker, because a lot of times double refers to double pole, meaning a 240 volt breaker. So these right here are tandem breakers. They're single, independently operated. They work in the same body. They snap in 1 slot, and they have on the bottom, I'll show you a picture of the panel here in just a second with a little bit different video showing you why these can only go in the bottom 5 slots. So this looks like a lot of circuitry to be adding to a panel. And in fact, it may seem that way. Well, we've just discovered that these are just for the 2 minimum required 20 amp circuits, 120 volt circuits for the countertops in the kitchen. These are appliance circuits. They must be 20 amps to handle coffee pots and appliances, that sort of thing. So there's 2 of those. And then we have, that's required. And then we have, these 4 are actually replacement circuits, okay, for existing. I have 2 bedrooms upstairs that were on all arc fault. They will remain unmodified. But I do have 3 rooms that are unfinished. They are unfinished. So 1 of them and 2 of them I'm actually finishing. So I'm modifying those circuits. I have to upgrade those breakers. So I use a or a tandem breaker for those 2 circuits for those 2 rooms for the receptacles around the building. The next one is I do have a dual fuel capable range area downstairs, and one of them has a 120 volt control circuit for when it's running gas. Now at the time it was put in, I would dare say to you that it was not a bedroom receptacle and therefore was on a standard breaker. So I am voluntarily upgrading one of those receptacles, and the other one is the 3rd and remaining room that has not been upgraded. So at some point when I upgrade or finish that room, I might as well go ahead and put the breaker in anyway to save the panel space. So I have 1, 2, 3 unfinished rooms, the receptacles for them, and the 120 power for the control panel in the gas range downstairs. Now, over here we have what looks like a very interesting combination of breakers. Well, arc faults are so gosh darn important that we have to have them on everything because we're going to save the world, except for fire alarms and refrigerators. The problem is that anything with a motor typically wants to trip an arc fault because they use brushes, and every time that motor moves from one set of magnets inside the rotor, it arcs a little bit. So they're terrible for those sort of things, but we got to have them anyway. compressor in your refrigerator is a motor, so it probably arcs a lot. So we know that they're so important, except we're not going to put a fire alarm on it in case it nuisance trips, and we're not going to put a refrigerator on there in case it nuisance trips and somebody has to call their legislator fussing about why their food is rotten because the stupid breaker tripped. Now this in the middle is for a mini split. And what we have here on this is actually broken and defective, has to go back, but it will work for illustration. This is a double 30, or a 2-pole 30 by 2 to fit 2 slots. So you get the 2 tandems in here, and they're both common trip. So this outer set is common trip, this inner set is common trip, and this is for the double ovens and the little cooktop. Down below, only one of these is being used, and that's for a dedicated circuit run to the proofer that you may have seen in some of the videos where I make bread. So it's just a little 15 amp, just goes to one single standalone receptacle, and it's going on to arc fault. So we've hit our 10-minute mark. We'll probably split up into part 2 where we'll look at the codes, the NEC codes for these breakers, and then we'll find out later on whether or not, when we put them in there, whether or not Mr. Inspector lets us pass.